Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 117 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. A very happy National Superhero Day if you're listening to this the day it releases. My own personal superheroes are my patrons, who I would like to take a quick moment to thank. Justin Bailey, Lily Breen, Jesse Clark, Ricky Garvin, Rob Garrison, Forrest Woodward, Aaron Borst, Carla Hoffman, Lyndon Onstead, Julio Herrera, Matthew Saint, and Utuk Zul. Once again, my sincere thanks go out to you for supporting the show. It's just $1 per month to join in, which gets you this monthly shoutout and access to the full scripts and bloopers for the scripted shows and the unedited versions of unscripted episodes, like this one. One last thing before we get started on this deep dive on episode 4 of Moon Knight. I want to apologize in advance. In our conversation, I refer to the figurines that hold Khonshu, Ammit, and the other Egyptian gods as Ubshatis, when the word is actually Ushabtis. This was an unintentional error on my part, and I will strive to do better in the future. Now, let's get going. My guest, author John Mulhall, warned me ahead of time that he had some issues with the writing in this episode, and so with some trepidation, we get into it. Well, let's get started right at the very beginning and see where those issues start, because that first shot I thought was great, with the Avatar walking through with Khonshu's Ubshati.
Yes. Starting upside down.
Yeah, starting upside down and rotating around, telling you that the world is off.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a filmmaking shortcut for that. And we see that there's a bunch of Ubshatis all in this one place.
Yeah. Not their first rodeo as far as banishing a god.
Exactly. And so that might answer our earlier question as to where some of the Ennead was in the previous episode, because we noted that there were only either 5 or 7 gods represented, depending on whether you counted Khonshu and Ammit in there. And so I think there's a bunch of missing gods at this point.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this. It makes me feel, seeing that shot, like maybe the Ennead isn't really all square, that maybe they have their own agenda here, because they certainly are quick to silence and entomb people who disagree with them, who are at odds to them. So maybe their purposes are a little nefarious or off.
Yeah, that was my thought as well when I saw that scene. I'm betting that this is going to lead to some sort of final showdown between the Ennead and the gods who were up to this point trapped.
I agree.
But after that quick scene, and of course the Marvel logo, I wanted to note, we haven't really talked about it that much, but the music choices in this show have been excellent. Here, the Marvel logo is, instead of the usual, it's this Middle Eastern theme, and, some of the end credits songs as well have been some excellent Egyptian or other Middle Eastern songs, even if they have some Western influences as well.
Yeah, both the score and the music drops throughout the show have been very good.
Yeah. So after that, we cut back to basically where we ended the last episode, with Steven on the ground unconscious after Khonshu had just been taken away, and Layla's down there trying to wake him up, when Harrow's men arrive and try to take them out.
But she's able to drag him to somewhat sort of safety, rolling him down a sand dune. I don't know if that's my idea of a good time, but at least it gets him out of the line of fire.
Yeah. I would much rather go rolling down a sand dune than be shot at.
Yeah.
If I'm given the choice between those two options.
Exactly.
And I thought she did a really good job of taking care of these guys. First she hides in the truck, and then she grabs a couple of flares and is able to distract them for a second when they discover Mark's body, or Steven's body, whichever you prefer. And then she gets that second flare out and tosses it right into the box of ammunition that's there and causes that to explode.
Yeah. I mean, again, showing herself to be very capable, taking a page out of Alan Grant's playbook from Jurassic Park and distracting them with the bright and shiny object.
Yeah.
It's cool that they're just quickly dispatched by her. That's neat.
Again, much more proactive and capable than her comic book equivalent of Marlene.
Yeah, it sounds that way.
And then they continue their trek towards the tomb. And we get a little more conversation between Steven and Layla here. Layla wants Mark to be dominant at this point, and Steven refuses. And he tells her all about the deal that they made, where once Khonshu's gone, Mark will go away as well. And you really are seeing the relationship between Layla and Mark being frayed at this point, with her saying, shouldn't I have been consulted on this at least?
Right. You guys made a deal about my life. Great.
Right. But when Mark and Steven made their deal, if I'm remembering right, that was in the storage unit before Steven ran out and ran into Layla. So, at least on Steven's end, he didn't know Layla existed, really.
Right.
So he wasn't making a decision on her behalf.
Right, other than the phone calls and speaking to her on the phone briefly. But yeah, he had no relationship with her.
Yeah. So yeah, Layla's unhappy at this point, obviously, with Mark. And there was a quick funny moment that I specifically noted at this point, where she's like, all right, well, I guess it's just you and me then. And Steven's like, yeah, you and me and the open road. And then the car immediately stops. Well, we're going to have to go on foot from here. All right.
That made me laugh as well. And the open, yeah, basically.
So at that point, they are walking through a small river canyon, and that's why they have to go on foot. And some beautiful shots in that brief scene when they're walking through there.
Now, I heard, and I don't know if you've heard this as well, or that's basically the same area that they shot Last Crusade.
I didn't hear that, but that doesn't surprise me.
I don't know 100% if that's the truth, but that's what I had heard, and it certainly seems to make sense.
Yeah. It does look very similar to where the Grail was entombed in that movie. So, like I said, I hadn't read that, but I totally believe it. But they quickly get through the canyon and they find the cult's campsite, where an entrance to the tomb is.
Yeah.
And fortunately for them, all of the cult is down in the tomb.
And this is where my issues with the episode begin.
Okay. Well, you warned me ahead of time.
Yeah.
So what are your issues at this point?
There's a couple of things, but one of the biggest things for me is that there's so little tension in this part of the episode. They're basically walking into the camp of the enemy. It's more or less a ghost town, and that should raise some red flags. Even if it's not completely vacated, they should be on their guard. There's so many references back to Indiana Jones. And I think of the scene in Raiders where after they escape the Well of the Souls and they're trying to get back to the Ark or find the Ark, and they're trying to, I don't know, I'm making this up as I go along, let's we're hiding and we're moving and we're just trying to get there. And, it feels to me like there was no tension at all. Like they just kind of walk into this camp and they split up and they start looking for supplies, and there's all this unimportant conversation and kind of flirting. And I'm like, you're in a place that's very dangerous and you're racing against time. Like, what is going on right now?
Well, I didn't think that conversation was unimportant. I thought at this point that the stakes are much more emotional rather than physical. Because we get some definite action scenes and physical stakes later on. But for me, I really like the character moments even more than some of the action stuff. I still enjoy the action, but the character stuff is what really pulls me in. And so getting that argument between Steven and Mark about, are you in love with my wife? And that sort of stuff while he's looting around for supplies, I enjoyed that. I can understand your view on that, and it is very easy on them to get through the camp. But I think at that point we needed the setup of how Mark and Steven are feeling towards each other more than we needed a sneaking around.
Let me say this.
Okay.
I agree with you that character moments for me in the episode are the things that I remember more than the action. I agree with that 100%. But there were times where we could have done this before we're sitting in the enemy's camp. There was time in the car. Mm-hmm. There was even time, you could have even restructured some of the episodes to have some of these conversations take place after the incident in the last episode where Harrow finds them at the sarcophagus. I think there's plenty of time for those character moments, and the time not for those character moments is when you're fighting against the clock, trying to skirt an enemy. There's no reason to put our characters in the midst of things and then have these character moments, because for me they ring a little hollow at that point. And that continues for me as we go through the cave and on to the point at the end of the episode when they've got the Ushanti and it's like, we need to get out of here now, not have this argument. I don't know if there's a term for it, but there's a cliche that happens for me where it's like, I don't care that everyone's shooting at us. I'm not going one step further until you tell me what's going on. And it's like, all right, that's not ever going to happen in real life. Like, hey, I know that, we're hanging from a vine, but I think we need to talk about our relationship right now. And it's like, okay. So, I feel like my issue with this episode is kind of a repeating one, mm-hmm. where the tension has been deflated. I don't want to grouse on this the whole time we talk, so I'm going to get my venom out of the way. But it's like maybe the wrong time to talk about this is not when there are people with guns and Haka priests from the dead hunting us. Maybe we should talk about this later, Now, anyhow, there are a few moments I'll circle back on this, but for the most part, I'll get it out of the way and then tell you what I liked, because I don't want to be negative the whole time. But I definitely had a recurring issue with this kind of lack of tension. They're basically trying to, for all intents and purposes, save the world, and they're certainly not acting like it.
Yeah. Like I said, I can totally see your point of view on this. And yes, it definitely is a trope of having relationship type stuff get in the way of what should be obviously a more important and vital thing. Later in the episode, I think it makes more sense, because if you think this man killed your father, wouldn't you want to know whether or not that was true before you went anywhere else with him?
I think if there were zombies chasing me, I think that's a conversation. It's not like my father just died. Yeah, I'd want to have that conversation, but some evil jerk just told you this news. I maybe don't give it 100% weight and have this conversation when you get free.
Yeah.
Forget about the logistics of like all his people went into the tunnel before them and then somehow they didn't run into any of them until the very end. I don't know. It was a messy episode for me, but I would definitely get out of there because they're clearly coming for you. I mean, I get that there's a lot of emotion involved in that, but I really do feel like as humans, we're going to be able to go, okay, that needs to take a back burner to zombie priests and guys with guns and saving the world. The fact that they're trying to get this to avoid Amet coming back and judging humanity. I mean, they've set the stakes high in the first couple of episodes and they get thrown out the window. Now, I will say too, I realized that looking at comments online, I'm in the minority on this. People really enjoyed the parts of the episode that I also enjoyed, and they looked past this. And that's just something that I have a real hard time with it, because it feels messy and it feels sloppy and it feels kind of beneath where the MCU has been writing for me. Mm-hmm. So it kind of bummed me out. I want to walk away and go, I'm on board. This was a rare instance for me of kind of going, I don't know.
Yeah. I understand. There's been things in other properties where it's bumped me and I've had issues and other people are like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So I understand.
And that's the other thing. I always am wary of bringing this up because if someone enjoyed it, if the episode worked for them, that's great. I like when people enjoy things. I don't want to, as they say, yuck your yum. But at the same time, it didn't work for me, and this is why. That's
Yeah.
where I'm coming from.
So moving on in the story,
Yeah.
there was a brief moment while they're still searching out the supplies where we see Layla looking around for stuff, and the shot pans down to this bloody instrument in the sand.
Yeah.
And I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think that that's the instrument that they use to go up the nose and remove the brains during the mummification process.
That makes sense. It certainly wasn't clear to me. And I said I watched it 3 times this episode, and every time I'm like peering at it going like, it's clearly significant. So what am I missing on it? Did she hurt somebody with it, or was it there already? And
I'm pretty sure it was there already.
Yeah.
That blood did not look all that fresh.
Yeah, I agree with you. That was my first inclination, was that it had been left there by someone, but that would make sense that if it was like some sort of a mummification tool, that would totally make sense in context of the episode.
Yeah. So I just wonder if Harrow and his men did some sort of ritual while they were still up there. We've mentioned these mummies, these undead creatures roaming around down in the tomb. Did Harrow wake them up somehow? Were they always there just waiting for anyone to come in and loot?
Right.
Or what's going on with them exactly? And the fact that we have this instrument up above ground and having been used makes me think that Harrow did something before they went in that might have activated them.
Maybe he knew that there'd be some sort of sacrifice required to move past a certain point or something. I don't think it was clear, but that all makes sense as far as theories. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. But after that little shot, we get well, I don't want to call it the meet cute, but
that's what it felt like.
Yeah, it did kind of feel like that, with the kind of flirtation back and forth of Layla strapping Steven in for the climb down, and then she almost goes in for the kiss, and he stops her and tells her about Mark wanting to protect her.
Yeah.
And she's happy that Steven is honest with her when Mark hasn't been. And now Steven goes in for the kiss and is successul.
Awkwardly successful.
Yeah. Steven doesn't appear to have kissed many people before.
No. Yeah, and that's all I could think of is when I saw her face was like, you look like Mark, but you don't kiss like Mark,
You look like Mark, you smell like Mark,
right?
But you don't kiss like him.
Yeah.
But she seems to still enjoy it, I think.
Yeah.
Obviously, there is something there between them.
Yeah, I think she's fond of Steven, and she looks at Steven and she sees the person that she was married to because they share the same face. But then I think something like that reminds her that this is not her husband. Like, this is another person.
True, but she seems to kind of like this person better in some ways.
I agree, but that's sometimes in life where you justify, like, this person's perfect for me. They're this and they're that and they're this. And then you go, what's missing? Oh, right. There's no chemistry. I'm not attracted to them. And so I think she's clearly attracted to his looks, but when he goes in for that kiss, it's kind of like, oh yeah, this is okay. All right. This is not the same, and she'd like it to be the same as it was with Mark with Steven. Because I think you're right. I think in a lot of ways she likes Steven's personality in some ways better. He meshes with her and better.
Yeah. And then there's another comedic moment here after the kiss. She heads down into the tomb and Mark takes over very briefly, long enough to punch Steven in the face.
Yeah, definite Fight Club moment there.
Yeah, the end of Fight Club when we actually get to see the narrator fighting himself rather than Tyler and the narrator fighting. Yeah, it just cracked me up watching that punch and then him fall down the well or whatever that was.
Yeah, that looked painful.
Yeah. But after that bit, the way Steven says, "Oh, look at you. You see Layla's eyes light up like she thinks he's talking to her." And I think she is feeling that chemistry at that moment, even though it turns out he's actually talking about the giant statues.
Yeah. He's much more at ease with giant statues, I think, than human women.
Yes.
And this is another area where in this scene where they're seeing the statues and they're seeing the cave, this is another scene where I feel like that tension should be there that's not. They don't know what they're going to encounter. And she even finds bullet casings and she just kind of goes, what would they be shooting at? And it's like, that should scare you, I would think. There should be no shooting down here. You know, that's a little scary.
Yeah, I was okay with it being a little more awe and wonder at this point before we get into the terror a little later.
Again, it's not so much that I don't want there to be awe and wonder. It's just in the context, I go, you have to balance. And it felt to me like you had a lot of the one and not a lot of the other. You're getting the awe of them coming into this cave, but without like the real world possibility that there might be somebody there waiting for them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they specifically found a separate entrance from where Harrow and his men had gone in. So I don't think they were immediately concerned.
Was it a separate entrance?
Yeah. When they're approaching, she says, we're going to have to find another way in order to beat them to Amit's tomb. And we see the entrance that Harrow's men used, and it's a kind of upright structure. There's a arch or a doorway kind of thing there that they've set up, whereas Layla and Steven go down this vertical shaft.
Yeah.
So they definitely went in a different way, which is how they're able to get to the tomb first.
Makes me wonder, like, why did they dig up this separate entrance if they're not going to go in that way? Like that's, again, feels a little sloppy to me. But
yeah, that kind of bugged me a little bit, the fact that they don't explain how they found a second entrance. Yeah. They just kind of say, well, we've got to find another way in, and then look, here's another way in.
Right.
So that was a little lazy on the writer's part.
And I will say this too, Kurt, is that this episode ends obviously in a crazy way. And we're left to wonder if the first 3+ episodes, had taken place inside his mind. If it turns out that that is the truth, I will come back and apologize for all the sloppy writing. But because that is a way to explain a bunch of this stuff away if it's happening in his mind. But
I don't think it is.
I don't think so either. But if there's a possibility, and if that happens, then I guess all this stuff makes sense.
Yeah.
We had talked a couple episodes back about the possibility of them hunting down different things, like maybe the scarab was leading to the Umshati. I'm not saying that.
Upshati.
There you go. And then maybe them coming, finding the coordinates to the actual tomb, which was a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of, I imagined we might have a possibility of seeing a Raiders-esque kind of dig site where you're digging on a different mountain than the primary.
They're digging
site.
In the wrong location.
Right. So when we get there, I didn't think of it being a separate location. I kind of they're set up there and they're kind of invading their tent. So it's weird that they have a separate entrance for them to conveniently go into. But
yeah.
That is an interesting detail.
Well, it is a separate location. At least that's how I interpreted it based on what I heard and saw. And they're down there and they're in this room with 6 exits out. And Steven puts together that this whole tomb is laid out like the Eye of Horus.
Mm-hmm.
Again, giving Steven his job with the Egyptian expertise. And they realize that since the avatar is Amit's voice, then the path that represents the tongue is the best way to go. Yeah. And so that's where they head. I found it interesting that he said 6 senses, so 6 paths.
Yeah.
And there's the five senses that we normally associate, and then the sixth sense is thoughts.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about Egyptian mythology to know if that's accurate.
Nor do I.
But I found it interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, me too.
And here's where they found the bullet casings, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And then in the next room, they find the gore on top of that altar-looking table or whatever it was exactly. And that's where I felt like the tension started to ratchet up.
It definitely added some tension there, yes. Although it wasn't sustained. But yes, I'm with you.
Well, they see that the blood and gore is leading in one direction, and so Stephen says, can we maybe find a different way to go?
Yeah. I wouldn't want to follow, blood and bones either.
No. That would not be my first choice either.
No.
So he climbs up to that kind of second level and finds another way out. But before Layla can get up there with him, they hear the gunfire in the distance, and then that creature comes in. I want to call it a mummy, even though it's not actually like wrapped up in wrappings. It's not your traditional looking mummy, but it's still an undead creature of some sort.
She mentions the Haka priests
right.
that were sorcerers, and I can't help but think that's what we're supposed to take, that's one of those protector priests that were locked in there with the pharaoh and all the other treasures, and Ahmed as well.
Yeah. So I'll start calling it a Haka priest. And it brings that body in and starts vivisecting it on top of the altar. I assume that's one of Harrow's men that...
Well, I thought it was, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but isn't it the guy that played the cop, isn't it the same actor that was one of the cops that's also at the end of the episode?
Well, the cops were Harrow's men.
No,
so,
I know. That's what I mean.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't make that connection, but I totally would believe that's right.
They don't show his face very long, and he's kind of
it's pretty dark
down
at the same time, and yeah.
But I thought it was him, but who knows?
I totally buy it. It makes sense.
A detail I found really cool and kind of creepy was the way that these creatures they vocalize with these clicks, and
yeah,
it reminded me very much of like The Descent, the movie The Descent. Have you seen that one?
I haven't seen The Descent. My mind went to Predator.
Oh yeah. But it's in The Descent. There are creatures that live within a mountain, and they've gone kind of blind, so they communicate via clicks and what do they call it? Echolocation.
Echolocation. Yeah. I actually read about a blind man who taught himself to do that.
Wow.
He can click his tongue, and from the sound that comes back to him, he knows basically where things are.
That needs to be a superhero.
I believe that's Daredevil.
Yeah, except he doesn't do the clicking, but yeah.
Well, no, he does. Yeah, but yeah, I wasn't sure if that was their language or something like echolocation.
A buddy of mine pointed out that if they were mummified, their tongues would have been removed. So it's, that could have been removed. So that could also be what they're implying. But I thought it was neat and kind of creepy.
Yeah. Even if their tongue hadn't been removed, most of their soft tissue would be
right,
bloodless and non-functional.
Yeah. You wouldn't think mummies would be all that scary, considering they don't really have much inside anymore.
Well, it's the fact that they don't have anything inside but are still able to move around that makes them scary.
Maybe that's it. You might be right.
And unfortunately, Layla knocks over an urn while this is all happening, and that gets the Haka priest's attention. But then it almost immediately after that notices Stephen instead and starts heading up towards him. And so the two of them run off in opposite directions. Stephen gets a brief heroic moment where he pushes over some stuff and thinks he squished it.
I squished one. That's funny.
But I wasn't sure if that was the same one that later runs into Layla, or if there were more than one, or what was going on.
I mean, I took from it that there were many creeping around down there. I mean, when they first come in and they point them out, I think there's like 6 or 7 of them. So I just assumed that there was probably 6 or 7 of them creeping around and hunting them down.
That makes sense. Now we're gonna get a bunch of cutting back and forth between Layla and Steven at this point. We start with Layla, who has to make her way across this itty bitty ledge to get to the other side of this pit that seems to go for basically ever. And she almost makes it across, but then a priest from one of these little cavernous areas reaches out and grabs her, which even on my second and third viewing still made me jump.
I love that shot because the directors of this episode used a very cliched camera move, and it's become so cliched that we're anticipating now the jump scare coming from when the camera shifts. So we suddenly are going to see it behind her. And so as the camera is moving around, I was anticipating, I even thought it the first time through, like, this is kind of a cliched move. And then halfway through, he jumps out, and it's a great subversion, I thought, of taking something that we've seen played out 100 times and kind of tweaking it so that it's still surprising.
Yeah. Like I said, it got me every time. So it worked. And he pulls her in, and they end up in another room that looks very similar. And this is another kind of cliche thing. She throws both of them off of the cliff together, but she's the only one who can rescue herself.
Again, a very, very much a nod to indie films and
Last Crusade
hanging off the edge. Absolutely. When the tank goes off and they think he's dead, and so it's a little bit of and that's a little tired, but I'll take it as an homage and call it a day. It worked for me.
Yeah. I think most of this action works well.
Agreed. It's stuff we've seen before as a viewer, but they've talked a lot about taking, their cues from the Indiana Jones stuff and that the Mummy and the similar adventure films. So you look at it as a ripoff or as an homage, and I'll take it all worked for me.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. And after she climbs back up and gives herself a moment to rest, she sees Harrow on the other side of the pit. But before we get to their conversation, we cut back to Steven. And Steven is lucky enough to find the tomb.
Get very excited.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, understandably so. Especially when he realizes whose tomb this is. Alexander the Great is an actual figure from history and was one of the pharaohs of Egypt, but through conquering and not through direct lineage like most of the pharaohs. As they point out, he was actually Macedonian and not Egyptian, even though he kind of claimed to be.
Yeah, and I find it fun when they incorporate real historical details like that and twist them a little bit.
Yeah. And in real life, Alexander's tomb is still
unfound. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So to incorporate that as part of the fiction it works and it's fun.
Mm-hmm. Although before he makes that revelation of whose tomb it is, Mark confronts Steven about the kiss.
Because again, that's the best time to do it.
Well, Mark doesn't have anything else to do at that point. He's stuck inside the body with nothing to do. Having had very inappropriately timed conversations, I buy it.
I'm glad you do.
Maybe not life and death situations necessarily, but I've definitely had conversations where if you kind of go outside of it and look at it, you're like, is this really the best time to be having this talk? Probably not, but it's coming out now because this is what I feel and I need to say it.
I do understand that that's a thing. I think that, when you look at character, like Mark is a mercenary and he's basically got one job left before he's promised to disappear. It feels a little bit like a betrayal of character, but again, I don't bring it up again to harp on it more, but just I was getting in a jab, but
okay. All right. Well, I accept the body blow.
Not for you. I'm not jabbing you. I'm jabbing the show.
Yeah. And again, we're cutting back and forth between the two. We go back to Harrow and Layla, where he talks about her father and then brings up Mark and starts to give clues as to what's going on. We go back to Stephen, who's opening up the sarcophagus. And I love Stephen as a character. He's so much fun when he's digging down Alexander the Great's throat, and he's like, "Oh, sorry, Mr. Great."
He is fun. One thing that I can't knock at all is that the actors have been top notch all the way through, and Oscar Isaac continues to really knock it out of the park with two very distinct and nuanced guys.
Yeah.
So any of the issues that I have with the writing and pacing of the episode are not because of the actors. They've been doing a great job.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't really know Oscar Isaacs until Force Awakens. I don't think I'd seen any of his work before that. And I was like, he's okay, I guess. But here, he is so on point and so good and so different from himself, from playing these two different characters and having them be so different from one another. He's amazing.
Trying to remember when I first got exposed to him. I definitely was a big fan of Ex Machina, which he's very, very good in that. But he's consistent. I mean, he wasn't given a lot to do in the Star Wars movies.
Yeah.
So I don't knock him for that, but he's pretty consistently a good in what the things that he's been involved in. So I'm a fan of his.
Yeah. Agreed. And we'll cut back again to Harrow and Layla, and we finally get him telling her that Mark was one of the mercenaries that killed her father. And you can see her kind of not wanting to believe, but still believing at the same time. She's in tears over it, but she's kind of saying, screw you at the same time.
It's an interesting scene. Again, I wish it had taken place at a different time. I love that he's the one that's telling her these things. What I wanted to ask you about is your thoughts on is at the very end, as she's walking away from him, he says, wake up.
Yeah.
Very loudly. He screams, wake up. Is he yelling at her? Is he yelling at something else in the cave? What do you think that wake up means?
I think that's yelling at her. I think he's trying to tell her, see Mark for who he really is. You've been married to this man. You've been following him on this trip. You're trying to fight against me because you're with him. But wake up and see. He's trying to convince her, no, I'm the good guy here. Mark is the villain. He killed your father.
Yeah.
So that's how I interpreted that.
I thought it was an interesting phrase for him to use at the end there, because so much of the show has dealt with dreams and waking lives and dreaming lives. And so for him to say wake up, it felt a little out of place, but I was curious if I totally accept your interpretation of that, if that's what they intended. But I thought it struck me as like a little piece of dialogue that maybe was important in that moment for some reason. So I'd be curious to see if anything comes of that down the line.
Well, like you said, the whole show has been dealing with dreams and waking versus sleeping and knowing who you really are and who the people around you are. So I think it was very appropriate and tied in that current speech to just the overall themes of the show.
Yeah.
So it worked for me.
Me too. It didn't throw me. It was just, it was one of those things where just an oddly timed little piece of maybe disconnected dialogue that stuck out not in a bad way, but just something that like, oh, all right.
And after he tells her to wake up, they kind of go their separate ways. She heads off in one direction, and Harrow's men arrive and say they found a way into the tomb. And so they head off, and Layla meets back up with Stephen. And when I watched it knowing your issues, I assumed that this was the main scene that you had issues with.
Yeah, definitely one of them. For me, it's my issues start from the camp and go through the section. But, this to me is maybe the most on the nose. And I understand your take on it. And like I said, I know that for most people watching the episode, it worked. For me, I kind of went, come on, guys, like keep your eye on the ball here. I understand that there are other things at play. But again, mummified Haka priests, guys with guns, end of the world. Let's keep moving.
Yeah. But instead, she does confront him, and Mark comes out. He takes over.
I did kind of like that. It felt to me very much like, I don't know, that Mark got a hold of the body as much as Stephen went, peace out. I'm not getting, I'm not getting in the middle of this argument. You guys solve
This seems
this
like a
own.
lover's quarrel. I'll just back away.
I'm going to tiptoe out the door and let you guys handle this on your own.
Yeah. It also feels to me like as the show goes on, they're getting more accepting of one another. And so the transitions between them are getting much more fluid every time.
Agreed.
And so, yeah, Mark comes out and tells her at least what we assume is the truth, that he didn't kill her father, but he was there, and it was his partner who got greedy, killed everyone. And Mark says, I tried to save them, but I couldn't, and that's why he sought her out later. Again, this is very true to Moon Knight's origin in the comics. He even says, I was shot, I was left for dead, I should have died. But if it's anything like the comics, he should have died, but Khonshu resurrected him, and that's when he became Moon Knight.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how much they stick to that. They've seemed to keep pulling the rug out and twisting things a little bit. And I think there's an expectation that we're going to see something very similar to the comics. And it wouldn't surprise me if they did something a little different or went left when we expected them to go right. So,
yeah. The one thing that I noted in that scene was he hasn't said the partner's name. And so I wonder if it's Raoul Bushman, who is, the person in the comics who killed everyone in that moment. If it's Duchamp or Frenchie, which would be quite a detour from that character's history, but he's the only other name we've seen.
Do you think it's possible that the killer is his third personality?
That was the third option I was going to bring up. Is it a third personality that maybe even he's not aware is a third personality and thinks is somebody else he was talking to at that moment? Thinks that was his partner, but it turned out was another identity.
Yeah.
That's a third possibility. We'll have to wait and see and find out. I would think next episode we will get some sort of flashback that tells us exactly what happened.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to be kind of on par with some of the other shows, that the penultimate episode is kind of the episode where you get a lot of the expository stuff. I think about WandaVision and them going through her history through there, so that by the time you get to that sixth episode, you can smash your toys together and and not have to worry about too much world building at that point. So I fully suspect that in episode 5 we're going to get a lot more answers, but they've been very withholding on a lot of things that we maybe expected to see from the beginning. So
yeah, that's true. Like I mentioned in an earlier episode, Oscar Isaacs is only contracted for this one season.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that they answer a lot of our questions and that we get some satisfying answers to at least his origin and that sort of thing in this, because who knows when or if we'll ever get to see him again after this show is over.
Yeah. I don't anticipate this happening, but it would be certainly a ballsy move on the part of Marvel to have him be finished, killed off by the end of this series, and have Khonshu move on to Layla.
Yeah.
And have Layla be the new Moon Knight.
That would be interesting. I bet if they do that the comics would very quickly introduce Layla and
follow suit.
And follow suit.
I doubt they'll do it, but it would be, certainly an interesting spin.
I think whether or not they do it depends entirely on whether or not Oscar Isaac decides he wants to come back.
Yeah.
So moving forward in the show, Harrow shows up, Layla hides quickly, and Mark grabs an axe, and Mark is surrounded by gunmen, but he still fights back, and he's able to take out 2 of Harrow's men before Harrow shoots him. which was quite a surprising moment to me.
Me as well.
And then here's where the show gets weird.
Yes. Yes, it does.
And as you and I mentioned before we started really recording, these scenes here reminded us both of the show Legion.
Yeah, definitely.
Starring Dan Stevens.
Definitely.
Which is also based on a comic, but is a very trippy, cerebral show, and also deals with a main character who has a history of mental issues, a mental disorder.
Interestingly, I started watching Legion after Moon Knight first started airing. So just recently I started binging Legion, and I was kind of amazed because Legion came out, I think, in 2016, 2014. I mean, it's been a few years now.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I was surprised that a lot of the things that we were seeing in Moon Knight had kind of been done in Legion, not necessarily in the exact same way. But the mental illness and the varying realities and the point of view shifting and, all these things that are, very innovative for a superhero show have kind of already been done in a superhero show on television, on FX, I believe it was. And I mean, I'm just now the season 3 of Legion, but it's almost once per episode I go, this show is so weird. And which is the same feeling I had watching the end of Moon Knight, which I actually, out of the episode, I definitely had my issues with it. I loved the end. I really did.
Yeah.
And I've gone back and I've watched it on its own several other times, kind of go almost frame by frame to catch all the references that are hidden in there.
Yeah, all of the stuff inside the mental hospital here was so, I don't want to say dead on to Legion, but it had those parallels and made me definitely think about that show as well. And yeah, Legion, I don't even think of Legion as a superhero show.
Right.
It's based on an X-Men comic book character, but there's no, superhero fight scenes or
costumes,
anything. No costume, nothing like that. And so, I didn't think of it as a superhero show, but this Moon Knight definitely is a superhero show and is now bringing in some of those same qualities of that surrealism. And is this happening inside his head? Is this a dreamscape? Is this
the overvoid?
The overvoid, an alternate reality? Yeah. What is going on at this point?
I think back to that first episode when the little girl talks about being rejected from the Field of Reeds. And I'm like, have we been going through the Field of Reeds this whole time? Because that was a weird conversation to have right at the first episode. And here we are in this mental institution. It's either the show that we've been watching took place in his head, or this is taking place in his head. And like, really at this point, I think it's a coin flip for me, like which one it's going to be, I mean, I do think that obviously that surrealism that you talk about, that invades again toward the end of the sequence when he starts to kind of come out of his mental stupor. But if his meds are wearing off, then and he's got these mental issues, then that may be exactly the time where the surrealism would creep in. So I'm very, very intrigued about what's going to take place in the next episode based on this final sequence.
Yeah. And so let's dig into this final sequence.
Yeah.
We start first, as I said, Mark is shot and lands in the water. At first, the water looks like it's not even a foot deep when he first lands in there. But then his body kind of floats away into the water, and then there's a light behind him, and that light turns into a flashlight, which turns out to be part of a movie that is obviously another Indiana Jones homage there.
Yeah, ripoff.
We find out later the movie is called Tomb Buster.
Yeah.
Which obviously makes reference to Tomb Raider, which was another Indiana Jones
with
homage.
Production about as good as Tales of the Gold Monkey, if that's one that you remember.
Oh yeah, I was thinking classic Doctor Who.
Okay,
but
there you go.
Around those same levels of production, it, looks like something that may have gone straight to video in the late 70s, early 80s. But the main character's name is Dr. Stephen Grant.
Yep.
And we find that movie is playing in this mental hospital. And I couldn't identify every single one, but I think basically all of the characters in this mental hospital are characters we saw in previous episodes.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I know that definitely Crawley is the one, Crawley, who is also the living statue, is the one who's calling out the bingo numbers.
That's one thing that does indicate that this is not for real, is those bingo numbers are not legitimate in any sort of way. Those are not real. And I mean, he could be having his own delusions as well, this other patient, but he is not calling real bingo numbers. He even calls a T in there somewhere.
Yeah, I noticed that T. A friend of mine noted that the bingo numbers that are being called out are American style bingo. In Britain, when bingo numbers are called out, they don't do the letters in front of it. There is no B14. It's just 14.
Wow, that learned something new.
And so he wanted to point that out and note that this might be a clue towards Mark being the primary, as if it's all happening in his head, then it's from an American point of view rather than Stephen's British point of view.
Right.
So I said I would bring it up, even though it points towards your theory of Mark being the primary rather than my theory of Stephen being the primary.
Well, I appreciate you bringing it up, even though.
So yeah, Crawley is calling bingo. His boss from the gift shop is in one of the chairs, just kind of complaining.
I'm complaining again. She's definitely
Yes.
unpleasant in any reality. She's clutching one of the scarab plushies as well.
Right. And then there's another woman who's drawing a bird with Conchu's skeletal head on it.
Yeah. I noticed the bodyguard from the previous episode is handing out cupcakes, like the cupcake truck.
Yeah, yeah.
We see the goldfish.
Yes, Gus is there.
Yep.
Or maybe Gus's replacement.
Us too.
Didn't get a good enough look to see if he only had one good fin or not.
Yeah.
But we get this whole pan through the hospital to see everyone who's there, and then we finally get to Mark, who is chained to the wheelchair by the ankle, just like Stephen was in his bed way back in the first episode.
Yeah.
And he's holding a Moon Knight action figure.
Yes.
Which I found very funny.
Someone's told me that was actually a painted Skeletor figure, and I've not been able to really see that, but that's funny if it is, because, that's what he's making, his own Moon Knight figure, if that's the case.
Yeah. Now, maybe I'm thinking of the old school He-Man figures from when I was a kid, and I don't know if the modern ones are differently proportioned, but it looked like the same size as like a G.I. Joe or like a Star Wars figure, whereas the He-Man figures, including Skeletor, at least the ones from my childhood, are kind of beefed up.
Yeah,
more.
They're bigger and
around.
Yeah. I'll have to try to still frame that and really take a gander, but that's what I was told, and I didn't go back and look at it again, so I may be giving you misinformation.
And again, obviously He-Man is back, and so there may be new action figures that are more proportioned like the one that we saw on screen. So yeah, he's got the Moon Knight action figure, and he's looking in the reflection in the glass, trying to reach out to Stephen, who is obviously not answering at this point, and we'll find out why in a little bit. And I found it interesting that Layla shows up as, I assume, another patient.
Seemed like it.
And she takes his bingo card and is like, "Hey, you won. We won. I won." I wonder if that's reflective of Mark's feelings towards Layla, that she's at first seems to give him credit, then wants to share the credit, then wants to take the credit.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting moment to me there.
He's either putting these ideas from people in his life into his subconscious in a way that reflects his views on them, or a mirror on his views on them, or if it's the reverse, the people in his faux life are taking on characteristics of the people in his stay in this asylum. But I hope that the first few episodes turn out to be the real deal.
Yeah, I have to assume that that's the case. I find it very hard to believe that we're going to end this with it was all a dream, it was all in his head, but we'll see.
Yep.
And so it zooms in on Mark's face, and we cut to him now in a therapy session. And the therapist is Harrow. And like you said, in this reality, whatever it is, he was sedated at some point. And so we see through his point of view that his vision is really blurry, and he's not really able to really speak correctly at first. He kind of mumbles and moans at first before he can even say anything. And again, I think this points to this being the unreal, this being in his head, when Harrow specifically says, we don't live in a material world, we live in a psychic world.
Right.
And so this seems to be kind of like a mindscape or dreamscape or something like that.
Going back to that Legion thing, it's kind of an astral plane sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just as an aside, I've watched this episode 3 times, and every time he says, we do not live in a material world, I think, and we are not material girls.
Yeah. I had that thought as well. Yes, I also flashed on Madonna because we are both children of the 80s.
Absolutely.
I caught that reference as well, and my mind went there. But fortunately, Mark doesn't break out into Madonna. Instead, he starts to remember. He says, you shot me. And again, we see bits from the previous episodes represented in different ways. We see Harrow's cane, the shoes that Harrow wears with glass in them usually. The picture on the wall is the village.
Yep.
And so the sedation is wearing off, and he's putting it all together, and he remembers, you shot me. And so he tries to escape, and at first he's just falling all over himself.
Yeah.
But I guess adrenaline kicks in because he's able to fight off the guards who, like you said, I think those were the 2 cops from the earlier episode.
Fitzgerald and Kennedy.
Yeah. So he's able to escape them and runs down that hallway, which has a weird moment where the lights sway back and forth. Like the whole thing is on a gimbal. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a shot in a couple of the trailers of like a big boat. And I don't know what that's supposed to represent, but there's like a big boat against a night sky. And that was my first thought when all those lights went off to one side. It felt very much like being on a boat that was rocking.
Yeah.
And can't help but wonder if we're going to see that boat come into play somehow in this realm, wherever we are.
That would make total sense. I can totally see that happening. Maybe some sort of transport to the afterlife or to the overvoid or something along those lines.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Because it seems so weird. It wasn't in the original trailers, just some of the new ones that they've dropped between episodes. It's a real quick shot of this boat. And it feels so out of place that it's kind of, it's kind of stuck in my mind. So it'll be interesting to see if that plays a part.
Once the show started, I haven't watched any of the trailers. Any of the new
really
trailers that
either.
dropped.
It's just been recently that I watched a couple and I went, oh, that's interesting.
But after that, like you said, Inception moment, Mark kind of shakes it off and runs down a hallway and picks a random door, and there's a sarcophagus inside.
Yep.
You hear scratching from inside and a voice of some sort.
Yeah, frantic voice.
Yeah. Well, understandable if you were inside I would want out as well.
Yeah.
Even though I'm very comfortable in enclosed spaces, still, if I thought I was trapped in a coffin, basically, I would be wanting out as well. And we find that Steven is inside.
Yep. His actual physical manifestation of his other personality.
Yeah. And this is a moment that is straight out of the comics, one of the more recent runs where, similar to this episode, he's in a mental hospital and we don't know if it's in his head or if this is what's really happening or what is going on. But Mark and Steven meet up and hug, and that's when things start to turn around. In the storyline in the comics, that's when things start to turn around and he starts to break through back to reality.
Gotcha.
And I found an interesting little tidbit today. Obviously for these scenes where Mark and Steven aren't in reflections, they're actually interacting with each other, they needed a body double. And the person they got to be Oscar Isaac's body double was his brother.
Well, that's convenient.
Well, sort of, because he actually had to go through some physical training and stuff to get his body into the same shape, and they still used some minor prosthetics to shape his face even more. And, obviously they used CGE as well. But the funny thing that I have to mention is that obviously Moon Knight's real name is Mark Spector, and they came up with a nickname for the body double, and that is Mork Sphincter. So on set,
lucky him.
Yeah. So on set, Oscar Isaac's brother, whose name I'm blanking on, his last name is actually Hernandez, which I assume is probably Oscar Isaac's birth name.
Maybe a real
as
name.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah. While he was on set pretending to be his brother, he was called Mork Sphincter. So
that's quite a code name.
But the two of them hug and they continue their escape attempt, and they pass a room that has another sarcophagus in it. But they don't go in and open it up.
No, they ignore it. Just like they sort of ignored the fact that there was a third person killing those guys on the rooftop.
Yeah.
They discuss it and then walk away from it. And that's kind of what they did with the sarcophagus.
They didn't even discuss it with the sarcophagus.
Just look at it and...
Yep. They just kind of, that's a thing. And take off. And I hope next episode we get that opened, but
it's gotta happen. They can't keep pushing this out. They gotta reveal that now.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we're running out of time.
But they continue down the hallway and end up at a set of double doors, and the shadow, you can see through the glass. These double doors open, and this is the moment that everyone is talking about, with this hippo-headed woman who just waves and says, "Hi."
And their reaction,
very
sweet,
friendly
sweet
voice. She's just nice as can be, friendly, polite, and Mark and Steven just scream
like they've just seen the most horrifying thing.
Yeah.
Truthfully, if a hippo talked to me, I may be doing the same thing, but it was
Fair
at least
enough.
very, very kind.
She seemed nice enough. And as I've said, I'm not an expert on Egyptian mythology, but I had to do my research here and try to figure out who this was. And there is an Egyptian goddess called Taret.
Yeah, who actually Stephen mentions in the first episode that when he's talking to Donna in the gift shop, she says, "Bring me those hippos," and he says, "It's Taret. Actually, it's Taret."
Oh, good catch.
So we have a little bit of a foreshadowing there that
callback.
Yeah, that she's going to play a role.
And Taret, also known as She Who Is Great, is a goddess of birth and fertility. Which
it's hard to see how that would factor in, isn't it?
Well,
unless we talk about rebirth.
Yeah. Well, you could kind of think if the three personalities, the three identities become one, then that would be like giving birth to a whole new person who is actually whole for the first time. So it could represent that acceptance of all of their identities and coming together. And now we don't get to see much of her. We see her from about like the chest up, and we see one hand. In traditional Egyptian mythology, she has the limbs and paws of a lion, obviously the head of a hippo, and then the back and tail of a crocodile. which I found was kind of interesting because it's the reverse of
like,
Amit.
Yeah, it's like an inversion of Amit. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't find any specific note of this, but my assumption is kind of that they are opposed to one another, that they are like the antithesis of each other.
Well, that would certainly make sense.
Yeah. And one of Taret's duties is to cleanse and purify the dead, and also can be tied into resurrection. In mythology, she is the one that causes the flooding of the Nile, the annual flooding of the Nile, which deposits all of the rich soil onto the land and allows them to grow their crops.
How do you think she should be used here?
Well, like I said, one of her things is dealing with resurrection. So my thought is that she might be one of those Ubshatis that we saw in that very first scene in this episode, that she is kind of trapped in this other world, and that's where Mark and Steven are right now. Maybe this is their interpretation of the Field of Reeds or the afterlife or something, or the Overvoid, who knows. But I think this is going to be a way for them to interact with all of those gods who are now trapped, and that she, with her resurrection and cleansing and purifying abilities, she might be able to bring them back to the world and thus able to stop Hera that way.
That's very similar to what I was thinking, and maybe there might be some conflict between the gods. And we talked about a little earlier that, if that's the case, maybe this is a little bit of a way for them to, if the Ennead has gone kind of off on their own path, maybe this is a way for them to get a representative back out there to deal with that in a way. Mm-hmm. One thing's for sure, it was a hell of a cliffhanger.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We said last episode that the producers had told us that this was going to be the one that changed everything.
And they weren't lying.
And
yeah.
No. And again, I've read from interviews with the producers that episodes 5 and 6 are supposed to blow us away as well, that there's going to be even more revelations and new and unusual things to get us talking.
Well, in spite of my issues with the show, I'm cautiously optimistic and looking forward to it.
Yeah, I see your issues. I totally understand them. Personally, I didn't have them, but I can see where they would exist. So I'm even more optimistic, less cautious.
Less caution, more optimism.
Yes.
That makes sense.
So looking forward to these last 2 episodes and seeing where this takes us.
Yeah, can't wait to discuss them.
That wraps up this week's deep dive. Thanks as always to John Mulhall for joining me, and don't forget you can find out more about him and his literary work at johnmulhall.com. We'll continue our talk about Moon Knight next week with the penultimate episode. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, either on this show or on topics you want discussed in future episodes. Please send any and all of those via email to welcome2geektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome to Geektown or Twitter @GeektownPodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcome to Geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them,
Welcome to Geektown, population, us.
Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material, their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.